Hello, welcome to Unit 6 of our Climate Vulnerability Training. Unit 6 is about understanding the OUV vulnerability component of the CVI. My name is John Day and I've met you at one of our previous units, Unit 4, and I'll be presenting on Thursday the 8th of July with my colleague Scott Heron. In that training unit we're going to learn about how some of the key components of the CVI framework fit in. In particular, we'll look at exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. We'll explain how these components are applied in the framework, but also how we apply modifiers to further fine-tune how each component is applied. We'll clarify how the key values from the statement of OUV that you've determined collectively form a foundational part of the CVI process. In other words, we assess the entire property as a whole, OUV in one entirety, and how the three climate stresses are also applied. This is the initial framework that Scott took you through, which is based on the IPCC vulnerability approach. We use the same general framework. Scott took you through the definition of exposure and sensitivity and adaptive capacity. And he's explained how we use the same components to assess OUV vulnerability. Today we'll be talking about these plus modifiers, which are an important part of our framework. We won't, however, go as far as the full community vulnerability. That'll be the basis of next week's unit. And as Scott said, the entire, from exposure and sensitivity right through to community vulnerability, is part of the overall CVI framework. One of the things that Scott took you through was looking at the individual key values and then determining the three key stresses. Now, this has been an important part of what we'll use in this first part of the OUV vulnerability. I also want to stress when we analyse exposure, sensitivity and adaptive capacity, we do it considering the entire property, looking at OUV in its entirety, not the values individually, nor at a specific place in the property. So this is the framework we'll be looking at today, and while I've got this up on the screen, I wanted to stress that some of these elements, the ones with the sharp corners, we call inputs. So exposure, sensitivity and adaptive capacity are inputs. You'll notice the potential impact is considered to be an interim outcome, and OUV vulnerability is one of our key outcomes, and then we build on that to develop our community vulnerability. This same little element of the overall framework will appear as a thumbnail in the top right-hand corner of many of the subsequent slides. So you can see here we're looking at exposure in that little thumbnail on the top right. And exposure we look at on a range or in different levels here, level 1 to level 5. And we look at exposure, as it says here, of the chosen three climate stresses within an agreed time frame, as Scott took you through last week. So let's consider, for example, your climate stresses, and you have chosen, for example, these three. So you've chosen extreme temperature events as one of your key climate stresses, storm intensity, and sea level rise. Now, for each one of those in turn, we'll assess the exposure. So with extreme temperature events to start with, is the level of exposure very unlikely, level 1? Or is it very likely, greater than 90% level 5? Then we do the same for storm intensity. We look at the level. Is it very unlikely, unlikely, possible, likely, or very likely? And we give it a score. And then we do the same thing with the third climate stressor, sea level rise. Look at exposure. We also consider what we call modifiers, and these are very important because they can vary the exposure assessment. The two modifiers we look at, one deals with the temporal scale, in other words, the frequency of the event exposure. If we look at the four different options, exposure can be intermittent, in other words, less than one event per decade, occasional, frequent, or ongoing. Ongoing means more than 10 events per decade, or chronic. We also consider trend. What's the recent trend of the climate stressor? Is it decreasing or is it static? Or is there a level of increase from slow, moderate, or rapid? Depending on each of the levels for each of the 3 climate stresses, you'll give it one of these scores. It's important that these modifiers are assessed across the entire property. In this instance, we're going to be looking at sensitivity. So again, in our thumbnail here, you can see where the sensitivity aspect is. Again, we're looking to the sensitivity of the OUV of the overall property to the 3 key climate stresses. Now you can see sensitivity, different levels here. So if we look at our first key climate stressor, extreme temperature events, is the property, the OUV of the property, the sensitivity going to be very low? In other words, are all the key values going to remain essentially intact? And is the condition of the property either stable or improving? Or when we look at this climate stressor, is the sensitivity going to be at the other end very high, which means potential for the major loss or substantial alteration of the majority of the values, leading to a substantial reduction of OUV. So we assess each of the climate stresses, storm intensity and sea level rise, on this scale of sensitivity. We also consider modifiers in the same way as we did in previous for exposure. So the 2 modifiers we use for sensitivity, one looks at the spatial scale, in other words, the extent of your property affected by that climate stressor at any one time. And here you can see different scores. So if it was level 0, the spatial scale of your property affected by each of the climate stresses is less than 10%. It may well be that some climate stresses are down here, but others are very widespread, impacting the entire property, 91 to 100%. The second modifier we consider is what we call compounding factors. Now this is an important one, and this says this climate change is likely to be influenced or interact with other non-climate stresses in the near future. So for example, if your property is already being stressed by other factors, in other words, you're already being subjected to non-climate stresses, such as increasing decay of materials because of things like rot or insect attack or mold or mildew, is your property already destabilised due to earthquakes, or are there cumulative impacts because of things like tourism? Now, are those things going to have an impact, an influence with climate? If it's unlikely or unknown, give it a level 0. But if you think there is a probability that these things could be exacerbated by climate, these other non-climate stresses, then consider it low, medium or high probability. Again, it's important that these modifiers are assessed across the entire property, not just at isolated locations. Once we have these figures, they're put into a worksheet. Now again, I won't spend time on this now, we'll explain it more in our Zoom session, but the numbers allow us to come up with a modified exposure, a modified sensitivity, and then we get our overall potential OUV impact. And we do this again on a risk matrix. So for each of our 3 climate stresses, we consider the modified sensitivity versus the modified exposure, and we put it somewhere on this risk matrix. If it's very high and very likely, it's extreme. If it's, say, very low and very likely, it's low. So you can just see where it appears in terms of the potential impact. Adaptive capacity is the next important aspect, next important input. And this can comprise things like preventing the losses of your values, changing the location to minimise the impact, changing the uses of the activities, or restoring your damaged facilities. This little schematic in the middle here gives us an idea of, in this case, this value is being inundated by rising sea level or storms. And so there's a number of things we can do for adaptive capacity. We can hold the line by building something. We can reinforce and reclaim the area. In other words, bring the land out. We can build the structure up so it's less impacted. Or we can actually move it, what we call managed retreat. So each of these are options for adaptive capacity. But as well, there are things like educating and improving planning and changing people's habits, behaviour and their expectations to adjust to new opportunities or reduce potential damage. So adaptive capacity is an important part of our process. When we look at it, again, we look at each of the 3 climate stresses and we think, what is the local management capacity to deal with it and respond at a local level? If you have no capacity or limited resources, you might give yourself a level 1. And if you have increasing levels of capacity, right up to high capacity, then it might be a level 4. In addition, we do this for each of the key climate stresses. But in addition, we think about scientific and technical knowledge and support to address these issues. Do we have no support or no scientific understanding about these climate stresses? Or is there a low level of support right up to a high level of support? So both these are important aspects of adaptive capacity. But equally, we ask you to consider the effectiveness to address the individual climate stressor. So again, looking at each of those 3 climate stresses, is there a very low or a negligible level of effectiveness? Despite all your local management capacity and your scientific technical support, are you going to have very little impact on the effectiveness? Or is it going to be at a high level of effectiveness? So again, we do that. We assess the level of effectiveness to change the stressor for each of the 3 climate stresses. Again, once we've done this, we put it into a risk matrix. So looking at adaptive capacity versus potential impact. And that leads to the traffic light approach here of low, moderate or high OUV vulnerability. So having done it for each of the 3 climate stresses together, we then take the overall average and look at it on this traffic light approach. So I stress, for each property, we're going to look at adaptive capacity and potential impact across the property, but against each of the 3 climate stresses. And then we'll combine those to determine the OUV vulnerability. During the Zoom session, I'm going to take you through this example and actually explain again how these 3 climate stresses were used in these different risk matrices to come up with an OUV vulnerability, in this case moderate. What are the next steps? Well, I'd like you to log into Canvas, read the resources that are relevant to this unit and contribute to the conversation with your colleagues. I'd also like you to think about 2 answers for the following 2 questions, which we'll discuss during our Zoom session. I want you to briefly discuss some of the non-climate stresses facing your property that may interact or influence climate. In other words, what are the compounding factors that mean the fabric of your property may be subject to additional changes exacerbated by climate change? For example, are invasive weeds likely to get worse because of changing climate? The second question I'd like you to think about are what are some of the adaptive capacities and the resources you might require in your property? Will adaptation require relocating some of your existing structures, or perhaps building some new infrastructure to reduce impacts? What restoration might be required to repair your damaged structures? And is there capacity within the community to respond either via education or improved planning to minimise potential climate impacts? So look out for announcements about this unit in the week prior to our online Zoom event. Look forward to seeing you all on Thursday the 8th of July for our interactive session. If you cannot attend the interactive session, please send me an email, but stay in contact. So we'll be recording all these sessions for anyone to catch up later. The following week's session, Unit 7, is about the community vulnerability, so the second part of the CVI. So that's important to understand the vulnerability of your community associated with your property. So thank you. Look forward to seeing you all on 8th of July. And please ensure you've addressed those 2 preparatory questions. Goodbye.